Hello everybody and welcome to Commodity Culture, where we break down the commodity space for both new and experienced investors. My name is Jesse Day, and before we get started, standard disclaimer, nothing here is investing advice. Do your own due diligence. And today's guest is the Director and CEO of Leading Edge Materials, a Canadian public company focused on developing a portfolio of critical raw materials projects in the European Union. It's Mr. Eric Krafft. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, happy to have you here. So I want to start, like I do with all new guests, with the origin story. So how did you first become interested in metals and commodities, and how did that lead you to becoming the CEO of Leading Edge Materials?
Thanks. I'm Swedish. I spent the early part of my career in M&A and corporate finance. About 20 years ago, I found myself running a dry bulk shipping business in China, so focused on marine transportation and logistics of commodities which were serving China's surging demand at the time, mostly iron ore and coal. And that was truly a glorious period. China had just joined the World Trade Organization, and now we call that period the commodity super cycle, so extremely interesting. And since then, I have focused and been involved in various angles of natural resources, commodities, and energy. And I think the setup now in terms of some metals and commodities in Europe is even better than it was in China back then. We'll get into that later, I'm sure. Leading Edge Materials is a company that I invested in 2020. We then changed the board of directors, management, and we focused the strategy. I am the largest shareholder of the company, so I'm eating my own cooking in this regard. I'm also the CEO since last year. And we positioned the company to leverage these emerging trends that we see now here in Europe.
That's great. Well, before we dive into Leading Edge, I want to talk about the macro of critical raw materials in Europe. So first of all, could you outline the main critical raw materials currently needed in Europe and their main uses?
Well, Brussels has designated a list of around 30 elements that they deem critical in order to sustain our desired way of life, but they are also economically and strategically important for the European economy, but have a high risk associated with their supply. For example, there is more giga battery factory capacity in Europe than in the US, and in Europe we are building it out faster, so we will require even more metals, but we rely on practically all of these to be imported. But there's also other materials on that list, for example, phosphate rock, which of course we need as a fertilizer in order to feed everyone, and that's also important. So there's a number of these.
Right. Now, the EU is exposed to fairly significant value chain risk when it comes to these critical minerals, with China far and above controlling most of the extraction and especially the processing of commodities such as graphite, rare earths, cobalt, and nickel. So could you talk about these risks and explain how China came to be in such a dominant position in the first place?
Well, answering the last bit first, China is very good at strategic thinking and foresight. Their position now is the result of conscious choices. Good for them. Europe and the US, we have now finally understood that we need to adjust our priorities in order to catch up. And it's not just a question of global warming, which of course is a very important issue, and it has stimulated a real movement of millions of people around the world. But it's also a question of the future of European industry. The Chinese make terrific products, and many of them. And for example, now we see very good Chinese cars rolling around the streets of Europe. And this is perceived as a direct threat to local jobs, value add, prosperity, taxes, etc. There's also the geopolitical security angle, I hear from German friends that behind closed doors in Berlin, there's absolute conviction that Vladimir Putin would not have dared invade Ukraine if he had not felt so sure about the leverage he held over Germany and Europe because of our dependence on his gas, so that he could sort of get away with something very aggressive, because otherwise we would be freezing in the dark this winter. So it's now increasingly perceived as reckless to put oneself in a position of dependence on another country which may not share our Western values or geopolitical goals. I think the second and third order effects of leaving oneself vulnerable to those circumstances are really hard to predict, but what's sure is that nothing good comes out of it. I think politicians are unlikely to get away with making the sort of short-term instant gratification choices. In order to be re-elected, now is the time to be pragmatic and sincerely responsible. This is important for us in this industry because it means less space will be given to the sort of hypocritical and selfish NIMBYism movements, which has in many places turned European permitting into a real dysfunctional and unpredictable process. I think also, business aside, I'm a very patriotic European, and I think it's extremely encouraging to see this is all rapidly changing now.
Yeah, that's a great breakdown. And speaking of securing supplies, the EU recently proposed the European Critical Raw Materials Act. So this is a comprehensive set of actions to a secure supply of critical raw materials in the region. So could you provide some details on what this act means and its implications for critical materials extraction in the EU moving forward?
Yeah, it's a direct manifestation of the issues that we just talked about. And it's a response to the American Inflation Reduction Act and, of course, Chinese companies that have always enjoyed various levels of state support. So very briefly, the proposed legislation will require that 10% of these critical raw materials that will be used in the European Union to have been mined in the European Union by 2030. And this, of course, is incredible because 2030, in mining terms, it's like tomorrow morning. And, by the way, we are almost mining nothing of this right now. So this is going to require enormous effort to enable reaching this goal. And the politicians are actually not delusional. This is well understood by them. They are really committed here to do heavy lifting and do something really meaningful. Also, another important point, member states have to commit to 24 months permitting of projects that are deemed to be of strategic importance. And that, again, is really incredible because that, of course, 24 months is light speed compared to anything that we're used to. All in all, this is really huge. And I don't think that the dramatic effects this will have on extractive industries is fully appreciated by the mainstream yet. Personally, I'm in favor of free market, and I'm not a big fan of subsidies, and I think this legislation is a really sensible proposal and really helpful to make a difference.
Yeah, it does seem very encouraging for sure. So now let's dive into leading edge materials and the commodities that you're planning to extract. So to start with, before we dive into the individual commodities, could you give us an overview of the company for those who might be unfamiliar?
Yeah, we are a Canadian public company. We are completely focused on critical raw materials in the European Union. We are dual listed, Toronto Venture Exchange and Nasdaq in Stockholm. As I mentioned, I got actively involved in the company as a board member and largest shareholder in 2020. Alongside me, I have our chairman. He's Swedish like me. His name is Lars-Erik Johansson. He has a long, illustrious career in mining. He's a bit older than us. And recently he was recruited by Robert Friedland to build Ivanhoe Mines, which he did from literally one drill hole in the Congo. I think that was back in 2006. And he built it into the big company it is today. And I think Lars-Erik sees this as an opportunity to do something significant and important in his home country. Also on the board, there is Daniel Major, mining engineer. He's the CEO of a uranium development company called GoVX, where I'm also very involved since many years. I think Daniel is the best junior mining CEO, at least that I've ever come across. So we are a very engaged board in this. We have 3 assets. We have a built and permitted graphite mine and plant in Sweden. We also have a globally significant heavy rare earth deposit in Sweden. And thirdly, we have an extremely promising nickel cobalt exploration project in Romania. Very excited to tell you more about these, Jesse.
Yeah, great. And that's great to hear that you're the biggest shareholder. Skin in the game is something that shareholders always really appreciate. Also, having Daniel Major involved. I think a lot of viewers on this channel are familiar with him and GoVX because we talk about uranium a lot. So that's very fascinating. And I want to dive into graphite first because this is a commodity that's not often discussed, but nonetheless vital. So could you start off with giving us a macro overview of the graphite space and then lead into talking about the Woxna graphite project you have?
Yeah, actually there's many different types and qualities of graphite that have different uses. The attention now is given to flake graphite, which is the anode in all lithium-ion chemistries with, of course, the demand is growing exponentially. I think it will be the anode use will be over 50% of natural graphite production this year. So it will have overtaken the traditional refractory market in volumes. This is interesting. I'm very curious to watch the near-term price dynamic because, as we know, the anode use is growing very quickly. The demand is not so elastic. And then we will see what happens. And we had those big price spikes in cobalt a few years when that happened, lithium last year. So curious about that. China completely dominates this industry. And Woxna, our mine, is actually the only one in the European Union and one of very few built in the Western world. We've had it on care and maintenance since 2015, while graphite prices have been low. And during that time, we've been developing a downstream anode business plan. We published a 2021 PEA on that plan that returned a post-tax NPV of around $250 million US and a 37% IRR. We announced last year that we are evaluating a restart of graphite concentrate production, which would be the first step to then go further downstream.
Well, now let's dive into rare earths because once again, another group of commodities that gets very little play in the investment media space. So maybe you could first give us an overview on why rare earths are so important, where the supply-demand fundamentals currently stand, and then let us know about your Norakar rare earth project and why investors should be interested.
Yeah, there are actually 17 rare earth elements, and most of them are not very rare or valuable. The critical ones, it's really 4 of them, 2 light and 2 heavies. They are used for making permanent magnets, which, as you know, are used in electric motors, electric vehicles, and wind turbine generators. So these are 2 quickly growing uses. And in particular, it's the 2 heavy rare earths called dysprosium and terbium, which are very difficult to get hold of, and supplying this increasing demand appears very challenging. Again, China is the completely dominant voice in the permanent magnet industry. And there is right now sharp focus from both Europe and the United States to ensure that they will develop each their domestic magnet industry and associated rare earth metal supply. So our rare earth project is called Norra Kärr. It's in central Sweden. And why people should be interested is, well, first it's big, 110 million tons. And it is unusually richly endowed precisely with the two heavy elements, dysprosium and terbium, which are crucial. It's a globally significant absolute tier 1 asset. It's located next to all infrastructure and etc. It was advanced to a PFS, but when we took over the company 3 years ago, we went back and redesigned that project with a way to giving it maximum chances to get permitted. So we removed all chemical processing off-site. We decreased land use by 80%. We removed the need for wet tailing storage. We increased resource efficiency. We believe we can reduce water use to almost zero, etc. This new plan is explained in a 2021 PEA, which returns a post-tax NPV of almost 750 million US and a 26% IRR. We are now doing a Natura 2000 permit application. This is something that's required in Europe. And we're very pleased to have the new redesigned project seen and evaluated by all stakeholders. We're planning to start update on the PFS later this year.
Well, you've also got a nickel cobalt project in Romania. So first, walk us through the importance of nickel and cobalt and their main uses, and then also the features of your project there in Romania.
Yeah, so it's not in Sweden, but it's still in the European Union. I think it's the best exploration project that I've heard about at the moment, and certainly in Europe. Nickel and cobalt are, of course, used in the cathodes in lithium-ion batteries. So we got a prospecting license there 5-6 years ago. The early results from that were incredibly promising. But then we ended up blocked in court, and 4 or 5 years were lost. Last year, I managed to resolve all of that, and we were awarded an exclusive exploration license, and we've been advancing this project really quickly since then with terrific results. So in the license we have there's an old uranium mine. It was mined out and shut in 1993. But thanks to that, this area has been meticulously explored since the 1950s, first by the Soviets and then by the Romanians. And they found lots of mineralization, but they were only interested in uranium as it was back then, so they left it all untouched and continued exploring. So we benefit from lots of old data. We have people who were working back then in the 70s and 80s and 90s who are working with us now. And we have hundreds of kilometers of underground galleries. That's how they explored back in those days. So I call this a bit brownfield exploration. We want permission to enter these galleries in January, a few months ago, and we have a long list of targets, things that we want to look at, and just the first two that we started, we have encountered well over 100 meters of nickel cobalt mineralization. These galleries are full of oxidized nickel and cobalt, very colorful. We have, I think, some pictures in press releases and on Twitter. And it appears also that these galleries that are on different levels, they encounter the same mineralization. You find it in crosscuts. So we feel that maybe we are onto a larger system. these hot zones are being sampled and will be assayed now. And the whole point of all of this is, of course, to design a drill program that we will do in the second half of this year. Watch this space. I expect plenty of news flow from this truly extraordinary exploration project.
Well, thank you for all that information. Thank you also for joining us today. I'll put links to the Leading Edge website as well as social media in the description below so viewers can check that out. Before I let you go, are there any final words you'd like to impart about Leading Edge Materials?
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned uranium, and as an investor, I'm extremely bullish and confidently highly exposed to both uranium and copper, which I think the setup looks amazing. With Leading Edge Materials, speaking as a shareholder, it excites me that I feel that we have created a company with top assets and which offers a hugely convex exposure to these emerging trends which intersect at increasing demand for the energy transition metals and the huge stimulation now given from the European Union and member states to get these supplied from within the Union. So very excited to continue developing this.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Eric, and definitely hope to have you on in the future for an update about the company.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.